Thanks for joining us again on the Pretty Intense podcast. Today on the show is Vienna Pharaon. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist. She has a new book out called The Origins of You. Immediate disclosure, she was my therapist for about 1.5 years. We actually started the episode with me going into the 4 most impactful things that I learned while working with her. We went into depth into what those are, what they mean, how to access them. The thing about doing therapy and doing work and work on yourself is knowing how to even know to do it. It's like the first thing that we talk about is the observer, like how to access the observer. How do you even do that when you get caught in a moment? Like how do you stop it before you just end up in your pattern or in your trigger? There's so many good access points that Vienna gives as to how to get to those places so that we can truly just experience more joy, more peace in our lives. I mean, isn't that the point? And so, it comes through some pain, it comes through some change, and it comes through facing things and sitting in the fire. But I promise you, I'm product of not work that's done, as she states, and as I know, it's never done, but there are levels to it. And I love the work, and I love being more happy and more joyful and having maybe a more accurate perspective from time to time and not being caught in my patterns. Or as she says, the origins of you, meaning your patterns and your wounds that get developed when you're a kid. So anyway, great episode. Please enjoy this with Vienna. Hit subscribe and the bell for notifications. I'm super grateful for you here. And please let me know what you think in the comments and share sort of your experiences and maybe some pathways to growth that have really worked for you. It's pretty. This is a pretty book. Yeah. I mean, that's not always easy to do because
it's not. And it's very different. I'm a very neutrally person. It does it. It's it's a book that someone who doesn't know me might pick up because it catches their eye.
I actually think that the colors make it happy and hopeful too. There's sort of an underlying energy to the colors being the origins of you, which the truth is we're here to talk about the shitty ones.
Right.
But it's here, but they're in green and blue and yellow and red and pink.
Yeah. And then they open up the book and they're like, uh-oh.
You got a great chance because these are things that the world needs. And you're an incredible therapist. Truth be told, to the world, Vienna has been my therapist. You were my therapist for 1.5 years. So we have we know a lot about, well, you know a lot about me. I know a lot about you, but you know a lot about me.
Yeah.
And so I can attest to the fact that, you're incredible. And okay, I'm trying to think where to start. I was going to ask you about the book, but maybe since I've just said that, what I wanted to do is I went back to my notes from when we worked together and because there were so many gems, especially early on when I was so needing it, there were just some huge hits that I was wow. And that was kind of the magic of working together is that there was always just a statement at the end of each session that was oh, that's it. So you really distill things down very well. There was 4 things that I pulled from the notes that I thought were truly the most transformative things for me in my life that I still use to today. So I thought we'd go through them and you could explain them and explain what it means and how to access it and just sort of the origins of these thoughts. So I thought that would be
that's cool. I love this.
Okay. Yeah. So the first one is the observer, being able to access the observer and to pause and have that moment. So explain to people, what is the observer and how the hell do we get there?
Yeah, I love the observer. It's, I think the observer actually births from the witnessing component to what I talk about in the book. So first, the observer to almost step out of being in this moment, this experience, this conflict that you're having, this big reaction that you're experiencing. And it's in that pause. It's been attributed to Viktor Frankl, that space between, stimulus and response, right? And so it's in this space, right, where if we can just take the beat, right, pause for a moment and become the observer of what's happening in my inner world right now, right? What's going on? Because in that space, we start to be able to ask ourselves the questions like, what's familiar about this moment? What origin wound is this rubbing up against? I always say, right, that like as adults, it's very uncommon for us to have a first experience in terms of emotion. It's not uncommon to have a first experience of, content and context, something that's happening in our lives. But when it rubs up against, ooh, I'm starting to question my worthiness. I'm starting to question my belonging. I'm starting to question whether I feel like a priority in somebody's life. I'm starting to question whether I can trust this person, this situation, or I'm starting to question whether or not I feel safe in this dynamic, right? It's like those things, which are the origin wounds I talk about in the book, right? It's like, that's what's familiar. And so when we can become the observer in these moments where, there's a big reactivity, there's a pattern that I keep finding myself in, and I need to become curious and, get into the inquiry of what's actually being presented here, we're going to find something that links to something else that is unresolved about our past.
It's not really about the thing happening. It's about the thing inside you.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, you've heard this before, right? Like therapists around the world are like, it's not about the toilet seat. It's not about the towel on the bed. It's not about right? Like all of these things, which sure, objectively sometimes are quite annoying. Sometimes we're like, no, I promise it's about the towel on the bed. I'm like, listen, I get it, right? And there is also something additional that's playing out here.
Those are kind of the systemic sort of reactions.
Yes.
To the origin. Like, this is the hard part, I think, because it's like, all in theory, it's great. Access the observer, have a pause. But we aren't freaking Buddhas, right? No. And we're not on a mountain. We've got stimulus happening all the time. What is some ways that we can orient ourselves differently in the world on a macro level that gives us the ability to have a pause? Because it's not knowing that a pause is good. Everybody knows a pause is good. Problem is you can't, it's very hard when you get the stimulus or you get the trigger. So like, what is it that comes first before you can actually become an observer?
What I would say is to practice when you're not in the stimulus, right? So a lot of times we try to practice when, that we're on stage and it's like, nope, can't do it. Already activated, pissed off, in the loop, ready to go. And like, we're out, right? And so much of the inquiry and the curiosity, it's really helpful when we're doing that work, when we're feeling grounded, when we're just in a place of questioning and wanting to get to know these parts of ourselves better, when we're not actually in that hot seat. You're right. When we're in it and we don't have the, we're trying to practice the tools, but the tools are out the window before we even know it. It can feel like it's a pointless path to go down. The second thing that I would say though is, one of the things that helped me so much personally was that the more that I witnessed and grieved my own pain, the less likely I would need to hook into the pattern or the loop when it was trying to play itself out, even when the stimulus was happening. So what I mean by that is, when you can identify what the origin wound is, right? So again, whether that's, I don't feel worthy, I don't feel deserving, I don't feel good enough, whether it's, I don't feel like I fit in, I don't have a sense of belonging, I don't feel like a priority to my partner, et cetera, right? When we can actually see like, ooh, here's the thing that activates me. And then if I connect my dots and I travel backwards a bit, I'm going to probably find that lived somewhere else too, right? Maybe I didn't feel like a priority with a parent. Maybe I didn't feel like a priority with a sibling, right? Maybe that was something that was deeply impactful for me. And so when we go back into this origin space and we begin to actually process and feel and connect and witness the pain of that. Because usually those origin wounds, they do cut deep, right? They're not just like a brush, it's like, no, these are things that actually change the trajectory of our lives, of our worlds, of our beliefs about ourselves and other people and life at large, right? These are significant moments that set the stage for us. And so when we go back to those moments and we actually witness the little Vienna in this case, right, who was the observer and the witnesser of a tremendous amount of conflict and gaslighting and manipulation and paranoia and abuse as a little girl, through my parents' divorce, right? Like, ooh, and I get to witness her and what it was like for this little human who had no other siblings, who didn't have any other adults around to help her process this, right? Then I start to connect with the part of me that didn't feel emotionally safe, right? Where I felt like they had lost focus of what my emotional needs were at that time because, they were so distracted by their own pain and their own suffering.
Right.
And so when you can start to connect to that, to grieve alongside of it, I always say, like, when in doubt, grieve more. It's like when stuck, grieve more. Like anything, grieve more. It's like, yeah, our experiences need our grief. And my personal experience with this is that the more time that I spent with little me, the more time I spent connecting to that pain, the more time I spent witnessing what that was like for little me, the less I needed to engage in the dysfunction present day because I was tending to myself elsewhere. So instead of trying to get whomever, right, whether it's a parent or someone else, to witness or see or acknowledge me in this current moment, right? There was almost like a emotional bank account of I'm doing the witnessing. I've done the witnessing. I have a great partner who sees me, hears me, understands me.
Well, is this true? Like a comment that comes through and like repeated, like when you see the little girl or little boy within you, it's the innocence and the perfection. And you have, it's something separate from you, but it's still treating it like it's separate from you is still treating you. And so you'd never treat your kid like that. You'd never say you don't belong. You'd never say you're not worthy. So it almost like accesses the, is this really true kind of a question.
Yeah.
It's not.
Right. And it disrupts that, because that's what we're talking about with this, going back to your original question around, how sure the observer in theory is great, but in practice. And I think it's when you are tending to yourself or you invite in humans in your life who tend to you well, whether friendship, partnership, etc., right? Then you are less likely and less in need of engaging in the dance that is not going to go very well with a particular person, right? Like you don't need to hook into that dysfunctional pattern, right? This loop. And tending to yourself or having other humans who can witness and tend. I say it in the book, like there's this moment, I was talking to a family member. The conversation was going in the same way that it always goes. It was on speakerphone at the time. My husband was in the room. And after we hung up, he said, I get it. In so many words, he was validating an experience that I had, complained about for some time. I remember it was such a simple but really profound moment for me, because I realized that I didn't need the person who put the wound there in the first place to be the person who witnessed my pain. That's nice if we can get it, certainly, of course. But I remember this deeply profound moment of like, it doesn't have to be that person.
Yeah, well,
It can
they don't have to
be
correct the
someone
original
else.
wound. Yeah.
Right. And again, like in theory, might sound like, yeah, duh, of course, right? But I think so many of us, especially in family dynamics, family systems, like there's this wish, there's this deep want and need, right? That a parent might be able to acknowledge and, just acknowledge your pain, right? Or just acknowledge your experience, or just take ownership for something that you really want them to own. And so sometimes we get so caught up in it. I've had so many conversations with people where it's like, well, maybe if I say it this way, or maybe if I write a letter, if maybe I use this tone, or maybe use that tone,
leads to point number 2. That was literally the most transformative thing that you said to me.
Ooh.
Do you know what it was? Can you remember?
No, I don't know what it was.
Well, you talked to hours and hours, thousands of people. I don't expect you to, but it's probably because it's so second nature to you. But it's when you told me that day, after I was complaining about all the things and dad and parents, and you were like, nobody holds the keys. And I was like, fuck. Because I think the first thing I said was, I was like, whoa. And I started crying, and I was like, that's really heavy, because that means that it's all on me. Like, it's, I don't know if I said it's my fault, but I'm like essentially alone and figuring that out. And you're like, no, you're not. You have me, you have people, you don't have to do it alone, but it is up to you. It's like I say now, it's like, your wounds are not your fault, but they are your responsibility to heal. And so when you reminded me, or at least like got it through to me, there was like the freaking crack in the door was there, and you're like, nobody holds the keys, because no matter what anyone said, it just didn't work.
Right.
And so it totally flipped the script, which helps me with the observer, because I now know that whenever something is happening, all I do is say, what's my part in this? Because I know that it's my perception of a situation that is dictating the way that I feel. So I'm like, what is my part?
Yeah.
So nobody holds the keys. So yeah, I
powerful.
Love you. Yeah.
I love hearing
your words. Your words.
I love hearing it, because it's so funny when you're like, oh my gosh, I said that. You know, like, so many therapists are like, I don't remember all the things that I said, or you don't always know the things that are gonna land or resonate so deeply. But I do recall this, and I think there's that
You're psychic. I just want to say that. You know, you might not know, you probably know, but that was very apparent to me very early on, as you're extremely intuitive, and I can feel and see and know when you're in those spaces. And it's obviously super helpful that you are.
And you're like, oh, I'm listening to this. My ears are open right now. There's no one holds the keys, right? I think so many of us will get into a place where we start to outsource. There's this bargaining, this negotiation that starts to happen. Once so-and-so does this, then I will feel worthy. Once da-da-da-da-da-da happens, then this, right? All of these if-then statements, they start to enter in, and we get distracted by them. If only what? That doesn't resolve your origin pain, right? Like, that's a Band-Aid. It might feel nice, right? You partner with someone who, like, for the first many weeks is making sure all the dates are happening and they're following through and da-da-da-da. And you're like, I'm a priority, right? You're like, well, you know, maybe right in these moments, there's like a nice experience that feels good. Fine, sure. But that thing is not actually tending to the wound, right? To choose someone eventually, right, who does prioritize you, if you have a prioritization wound, for example, that's going to be deeply healing, right? It's going to be deeply healing. But when we go to this space, right, when we bypass it, right, when we try to bypass the wound and just pick the human who's somehow going to resolve what is deep inside of us for us, right? That can't last that way. And when I describe like resolving our wounds, we all know that this is a forever practice, right? We ebb and flow through it. Sometimes there is much less of a charge. Sometimes there's a little bit more of a charge, because that's how grief works, right? Every time we are brought back into contact with something, right? Like, yeah, there might be a bit of a feeling there. And so our goal is not to get to a place of being unaffected by everything, but this idea of Like no one holds the keys, right? No one else outside of you is going to do something for you that is going to resolve what needs to be felt and experienced and witnessed by you, at least first. Can other people support in that? Absolutely. Right. I'm a big believer that if it's relationships that wound, it requires relationships to help us heal. Right. And I believe that as individuals, we can only take ourselves so far because it's in theory. It can't be in practice without relationships. So again, in theory, ooh, this is what I'll say when this person does X, like that's nice. But until you are in those moments where the wounds are activated again and you're face to face with the beliefs about yourself that you've been trying to navigate and shift and pause with, right? Like it's in those relationships where we have to put, pedal to the metal.
Yeah. I think it's a good opportunity to actually talk a little bit about boundaries, because that almost feels like I'm going to get to the next point, which kind of has to do with it. But before we do, boundaries, like, because that's what feels like the natural progression when you take it into your own, take it onto yourself, and when you take it into your own hands and you don't need anyone else to fix the situation, is that it's actually because you're tending to the inner child, which kind of starts with the observer by going, what do you need? You now have a relationship with yourself and what you need. And when you know what you need, you're not relying on someone else to give it to you. So explain boundaries, because this is something that I totally thought was something for someone else, like, oh, don't do that to me. I never thought they were basically boundaries were from me, meaning like, this is how you treat me. This is what I'm willing to put up with and what I'm not willing to put up with. And then I leave. I don't tell you to change. I go, because these are my boundaries for me.
Like how we teach other people how to treat us, right? And like what's allowed and what's not allowed, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. I think a lot of people, there's the difference between setting a boundary and keeping a boundary. Of course, there will be people who cross our boundaries, and then we have to figure out how we want to, navigate that conversation or what we want to do about that relationship. But yeah, this is absolutely about where we draw that line for ourselves. And drawing that line for ourselves is particularly challenging when we have unresolved wounds. And, I laugh. I'm going to tell a little bit of a story here to try to make this make a lot of sense. I was a boundaryless human for a very long time. And if I journey back to my childhood, I know the origins of this. When my parents were crashing and burning around me, the way in which I decided to navigate through life was by pretending like I was fine. I didn't want to add anything more to the table. I was like, they're crashing and burning. There's no more room for me to not be okay. And so I got very good at all of the things that I wanted to do. And just from the outside looking in, I was a very well-adjusted, handling it so well little girl. And yeah, like succeeding. And I share often that I would always, if you ask me how I was doing, I was fine. I'm good. I'm unaffected. All good. All good. All good. You would hear that from me. So this little girl who is a needless little girl, an unaffected little girl, became a needless woman, an unaffected, I'm fine woman. And how that would show up in relationships was I presented as the cool girl. I was like, I'm down for anything, whatever you want to do. Absolutely. Sure. I'm fine. I'm unaffected by this. And that's really tied to my relationship with boundaries. I was afraid that I never knew that not being okay, that there was room for me to not be okay. The fear perception fully recognized that, right? Like I don't necessarily even believe that it was true about my childhood. Like I think that there probably was room for me to not be okay, but that just wasn't my experience, right? And that's really important, right? This isn't about what is true or untrue, right? This is how I internalized what was happening around me and how I chose to exist in the world, and then the work that I needed to do to shift that. And so in adult relationships, I also did not believe that there was room for me to not be okay. I was afraid that if I wasn't okay with something, that a relationship would end. This was tied to a worthiness wound that I learned, with my dad. Bless him. He's like, how much am I in the book? And I was like, Dad, you're in the introduction, and then you're also in the worthiness chapter. And he goes, oh, worthiness. And I'm like, no, Dad, not in a good way, in the conditional love kind of way. And he's like, oh.
It's always interesting when we have to, like you and I both being like in the public eye to some degree, like to have to sort of present these moments to our parents when they're included in our pain. And because of them, it's a tough part of the process. But I always hope that everyone knows, myself, my mom, my dad, their parents, everyone causes pain. Like it just happens. It's just, you're not, no one's special. No one's perfect.
No, that's it. So I get a good chuckle every time I talk about this part of the story. But, my dad, when I was a quote unquote good girl, right? Easygoing, fine. He was super helpful, super connected, super present, super loving. When I was a bit more difficult and challenging, i.e. like being a teenager or, nothing sort of out of the realm of reasonable, I would get the silent treatment and cut off sometimes, days, sometimes weeks. And there was a real punishment that happened there. And I share that part of the story because it did play into boundaries for me, the lack thereof, right? Having really porous boundaries, because there was such a fear that unless I was easygoing, unless I was fine and unaffected, and you can see how all of these parts sort of merge together and create this perfect moment of boundarylessness, right? Because it's like I needed to be fine, I needed to be unaffected. And then I learned that when I was a bit more difficult and challenging, that love and connection and attachment and presence, would be cut off, right? It like really taught me not to be honest. Why understanding our origin wounds is so important to how we relate to boundaries. I know that's the focus right now, how we relate to communication, how we relate to conflict, right? These things play into it. And so, sometimes they might seem really obvious. So for example, if you grew up in a family system where you needed to be the pleaser, then you might also have porous boundaries later on in life because you're just trying to constantly please people, because successfully pleasing people is what makes you feel good and worthy and valuable to the relationships that you're in. Having a origin safety wound, for example. And, the safety chapter is a tough one, right? Because it includes abuse, and we have to talk about that there. But, you could see how, for safety, it can go in a couple of directions, where with that wound, you could either be, super rigid with high walls up because people are unsafe and this is the best way for me to protect myself. Or if safety was internalized differently, maybe safety is about how quickly I can connect with someone and make sure that a relationship stays.
Is that codependency then?
Certainly. Yeah. Right. And so it's like, that's what's so fascinating to me about the wounds. Like, it's not black and white. It's such a nuanced conversation. And the same thing could have happened to me and you, but the way that we internalize it it's endless. Right. And so how we identify with those wounds can be so different. True. Right. And so, coming back to that boundaries conversation, right. It's like, when I started to realize how I had maintained this role from childhood into my adult relationships, I remember having this moment where it, again, sort of this profound, simple yet profound moment, an aha, where I was like, oh my gosh, I keep saying I'm okay in a particular relationship when a boundary is being crossed in like the most wild of ways. And I'm actually not okay with this. My palms were sweating. My heart was racing. I was like, oh my gosh, I could barely speak. And I remember calling my partner at the time, who was contemplating going back to an ex of his, and they were talking and spending time together and all of this stuff. And at the time I was, oh, it's okay. It's fine. Whatever you need to do. I get it. I understand. This must be so hard for you. The therapist in me, right? There's context, it's like, oh, there were so many excuses for it. And when I was having a conversation with a friend and I finally came into myself for a moment, like, how do you feel? Simple question. How do you feel? It's like, this is so disrespectful. This is so not okay. I remember calling and saying that and ending it. Even though he was in contemplation still, ending it, and never spoke to him after that again. And I always describe this as, for anybody who's ever done cross-country skiing and you have the tracks in the snow, it's easier there, right, than the French powder, right? And this was a moment where I jumped off the tracks and I made a new one and it was hard as hell, right? It's like, it was thick, it was deep snow, but I was like, I'm doing it. I'm doing that. I'm changing the role that I have held and carried from childhood into my adult relationships. I am speaking for the first time, like almost like a truth in a romantic relationship that was so scary for me. And I knew it was ending, right? I was choosing for it to end. So I knew what the outcome was going to be, but it changed it opened up my vocal cords. And my husband, Connor, laughs because he's like, definitely do not know that woman. He's like, you have no problems now. And I think it's like when you do it differently for the first time,
new pattern.
You're just like, I survived this. I can do this. This is the way that I want to live. Right. And, we have such a say when it comes to boundaries. But when we struggle to keep and maintain the boundaries, it's because an origin wound is activated. And there is a fear there because think about it. Why don't we maintain a boundary that we say we want to keep? Right? It's like there is a fear there that someone's going to get upset with us, that somebody's going to break up with us, that someone's not going to
be worse.
Right.
You just think it's going to be worse. You're like, well, no, that's going to be worse than if I just say, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, even like going back to, what you were talking about in theory versus in practice, it's like it's hard stuff because when we're in it, we want to move away from the things that scare us, that are going to support the story that we've held. But there's something so powerful to going back into the origin wounds to resolve that. So when the boundary is there or being crossed, it's not as hard to uphold it. Right? Because the more time we tend to, I am actually worthy. I do actually belong. I am a priority, right? When we tend to those things, right? Then in the moment, when we go back on our word, when we go back on the boundary that we say we want to hold, like we're more likely to keep it when we don't have to work so hard in believing that we are still worthy, even if it means that the relationship ends or a person is upset with us or, we're not a priority to them, something like that. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And it feels like for me, because it's going to play right into the next one too, which is basically about the lesson in not letting someone off the hook when they've crossed a boundary or said or done something that you don't agree with, and to not let them off the hook, because otherwise you're out of integrity. That was the lesson. Like you need to have integrity for your truth and to not let people off the hook, meaning a conversation's had and it's like, oh, well, they want some kind of validation or comfort. And then when you go in and save them, this is what it felt like for me. When I go in and save them by like, okay, yeah, you know what? Of course you're amazing. Like you're right. Like whatever that situation may be. As soon as you do that by saving them, you have now abandoned yourself again. And this connection with your inner child or your higher, your oversoul or your, higher self, whatever that may be, whatever you want to call it, you're not strengthening that relationship. You're continuing, like you're breaking it up, and you don't know yourself as well when you get out of integrity. So talk a little bit about what that means. Cause I actually found, that was one of them that I became very early in our work where, I thought it was going to be very hard to catch the moments because I just didn't know if I'd be able to identify it, but it happened like twice really soon, and I upheld my boundary. And you know what it was like, kind of like when you turn off the tracks and you go a new direction, like you're just on it now.
Yeah.
Like I just got it. And then it continued to strengthen this bond with myself and my boundaries and my integrity and who I really was and what I really stood for by staying in integrity. So explain what it means to not let people off the hook so that you stay in integrity.
What you were describing is not rupturing the trust with yourself, right? Because every time, we say we're going to do something and we don't, and even though there's a reason for it and there's a fear and all of that, like we are teaching ourselves that we can't trust ourselves, and that follow through, when we can strengthen that muscle, right? It's vital. It's vital. It's when we hold other people accountable, right? When we don't let other people off the hook. I think sometimes people are like, hear them, they're like, but I don't want to be mean, like, and I think it's very important, right, to be able to hold accountability and grace and compassion for the human experience. It's a very important piece. And I think we can all use a lesson in that, right? Is like, how do I still remember the context without making excuses? Right? Without minimizing, my experience of something or minimizing somebody else's, right? Without needing to give an explanation for something and, minimizing or distorting the impact of something. And so, it almost feels like an art form, right? Of like, how do I stand firm in honoring what my experience is? I don't need to annihilate you. I don't need to rip you apart. This isn't what that is. I don't need to sit here and point fingers and blame and this and that. But I also don't need to make excuses, avoid, shy away from, focus so much on the context, which is, one of the things that I did for so long. And again, as a therapist, it's like, oh, this is all I do it all the time, right? I'm like, context, right? It's like, we need that. But to not overplay that, because we get washed away. Our experience gets washed away when we don't say, I'm hurt, or that affected me, or I didn't feel good when you said those words, or, whatever it might be. And listen, that brings us face to face with, it could be a fear of confrontation. It could be a fear of conflict. It could be a fear of,
a relationship ending.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's like there are endless things. And again, it's like why going back into our story is so important, because if we have a fear of conflict because we grew up in a family system where conflict meant abuse, or conflict meant, the silent treatment for weeks on end, or, something like that, then we could exist in relationships avoiding that, trying to create safety for ourselves by taking a path of opposition and being non-confrontational at all. But in that, we lose that space, right? This beautiful space to be able to use our words, open up our voice, and be heard. And that's why I sit here, because I don't want the listener to be like, okay, you just have to say what you need to say and stay in integrity and do this. It's like, no, there's layers to this, and there's complexity to this, because before you can do that, you have to understand what keeps you from doing it. One of my favorite, this is the constraint question that therapists use, right? Instead of being like, why don't you do this? We ask, well, what keeps you from doing it? Yeah. That perspective shift is important, right? Because there are, when we sit here and we're like, well, obviously this is a good thing to do, right? Anybody listening to this is like, yeah, I want to be in integrity. I want to be able to trust myself. I want people to be able to hear what it is that I'm feeling, right? Like, all sounds nice, but I can't do that. Okay, why can't I? What keeps me from doing it? When we start to answer that question, right, that's going to point us again in the direction of what needs to be healed, what needs our attention, what needs resolution, so that I can start to step into this direction of being able to hold another person accountable, really hold myself accountable in that space to say, hey, this is the experience that I had, and I want to share that with you because I want you to know the impact that XYZ had on me.
Yeah.
But again, we can't, bulldoze our way into that. We have to understand why that's so hard for us to do and what it is that we need to process and resolve in order to begin to step in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
When I talked about that boundaries piece with that former partner, one of the reasons why I could do that was because I started to identify my origin pain, right? Where this all birthed. I started to spend time with that. I started to witness it. I started to grieve it, right? So that I could then move in that direction,
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it's not always an easy thing to do, especially when we have spent decades of our lives doing it differently, pleasing people, showing up quote unquote perfectly, not being a disruptor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? Like there's endless ways in which we have, existed in the world.
To survive. I mean,
To
these are all
survive.
survival tactics when we're young because we literally need our parents to survive. We can't work, we can't drive,
Yeah.
we can't reach the stove yet. We literally need our parents. So the fourth big takeaway came a little later, but it was talking about unconditional love. And I just, it was just so important to hear you say that love can be unconditional, but relationships are not.
Yeah.
So what does that mean?
That's a big oof moment. It is. Yeah, we use that language, right? Like, oh, this is unconditional. It's like,
Right.
no, love, I do believe can be, right? We
Right.
can have an unconditional love for someone, but we must have conditions in our relationships, right? There must be, right? Because otherwise people can say, well, I can do anything I want to do. Not that most people operate this way, right? But I can do anything that I want to. And then you need to choose this relationship anyway. No, there are rules, there are expectations, there are agreements, spoken ones, ideally, right? That we have. And, I can love someone, of course, but choose not to be in relationship with them if the way that they show up, the way that they talk to me, the way that they treat me doesn't match with what is workable for me in that chapter of my life. We've all heard, oh, love is unconditional, relationships are unconditional. It's like that message was it felt like such a dangerous one, right? Because it almost forced people to have to bypass their experiences and their feelings and be okay, or like find a way to be okay with things. And I think this is such a healthy way to exist in the world, right? That to find what the conditions are, what we want to create out of this relationship together, what we are. And listen, it can ebb and flow and it can move a bit. Like we can have an expectation, if you're in a monogamous relationship, for example, that we're not going to cheat on each other. Okay. Right. Then that could shift because someone could cheat. And that doesn't mean necessarily, right, that relationship is going to be over immediately, right? There's a lot of conversation. There's a lot of navigation that can happen in that space. But I think it's, we know we have to check in with each other over and over and over again to make sure that the conditions of our relationships are up to speed. A lot of times couples, for example, they have certain expectations or agreements for the relationship, and then they never check in with each other for the next 5 years or 10 years.
Totally.
And it's like, wait, the agreements are changing, and we need to be able to communicate about that. And
it's like not updating your will and having kids and all kinds of different things. It's like, no, obviously things have changed. A lot has happened. You've got to keep that stuff up.
Yeah. But I think there's an empowerment in that sentence, right? It's like love can be unconditional, but relationships cannot, right? They have to require that. And there's an empowerment there that says I don't have to accept anything.
Yeah.
Right? I don't have to just sit here and be like, well, because I love you, because we agreed to this, like anything can happen here. Like I'm allowed to have conditions to being in this relationship. These are the conditions for us to succeed as friends, as partners, as this, as that, whatever it is. And to not have to be afraid of communicating that and sharing that. And again, of course, right, like setting the boundaries around that.
Yeah, it could be called unboundaried love too. It
Right.
feels like another word for it that could replace it. But I like to think of it as like these conditions or boundaries or whatever the word you want to use for it for the relationship that's not unconditional is like it's supposed to help you know how to love me right. Like I'm not going to make it a freaking mystery. I'm going to tell you what you have to do. This is the key to the kingdom, right? If you can live, if this works for you, great. If it doesn't, fine. We all should move on. But that's like unboundaried, unconditional love is not that helpful because it's impossible to imagine that we don't have triggers and we don't have wounds and we don't have things we're working through. And like you said, sometimes we're more sensitive, sometimes we're less sensitive. We just don't navigate life like a Buddha, we navigate life being triggered. And unless we tell our partner or the people that are close to us what those landmines are and what it makes us comfortable and feel safe, like how can they be expected to do a good job? It's like giving a pilot an airplane and no lesson. It's like, we're going to crash. Yeah. They're going to crash and burn,
No, I think it's like the conditions are actually what allows a relationship to thrive.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, otherwise it can just be chaos, and that's it, is like, no, this isn't meant to like squeeze something, right? It's meant to create the environment for the relationship to evolve and thrive. And so, yeah, I love that one too. I'm glad that was one that stood out to you.
Yeah, those were the 4 most transformative.
Wow.
For sure. And I mean, look, I like have those were literally like I always write my notes like they are right at the top, and I have like infinitely more questions I was going to talk to you about. Of course, some of them got a little bit included, but one of them that I want to ask about, because this feels a little nuanced, but I don't quite have a grasp as to how to see this, feel this clearly, and execute this. So maybe you can help me. What does it take to help someone see you or to see someone else? Like people always say and want to feel seen. They want to feel heard. Like this is something feels like a really deep level, maybe not the deepest level, but this is a very deep level that creates a tremendous connection. So is it something I have to do? Is it something someone else has to do? Is this some magical connection that you just have to find the right person and you feel seen? Help a girl out. Help a boy out. Help us out.
Yeah. The first thing that comes to mind is that it can be very confronting to see another when what is being asked to be seen requires that person to then see that in themselves.
Oh man. Fucking relationships.
Yeah. And it's that part can be because when one person is being vulnerable, like again, we can listen high level and like, yeah, okay, thanks for sharing that with me, yada, 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 right? Like many people can kind of go through those motions. But I think when we're talking about being seen, that like the nuanced scene, we're talking about someone really deeply connecting to the experience. There being a level of, not that they necessarily walked the same experiences as you did or can relate firsthand to that specific thing, but there's an access point that happens when a person has seen a deep pain within themselves that then allows them to see a deep pain within another. And I think when a person is asking to have a deep pain of theirs seen by a partner, and a partner or a friend or whomever has resisted, consciously, unconsciously, it doesn't matter, but has resisted or not been able to see their own deep pain, that can be incredibly challenging. I think it's one of the biggest constraints that I notice. And, because it's like, if I have to connect to it and see it with you, then there's an access point for me. And sometimes people don't want to connect
go
to
there.
it. They don't want to go there. They don't know how to go there. It feels too scary to go there. It means that the idealized, story of their childhood or their parent or whomever is going to get, shifted slightly, right? Like all of those things can be a deterrent in that way. And so a lot of times, right, it's like, oh, to go into, intimacy, right? Going inwards, seeing my inner world, seeing your inner world, having you see my inner world, having you see your inner world, right? It's like where the blocks are for the self, there are blocks for others. There have to be, right? Because otherwise it requires something that you're not ready to meet in yourself. And so I
Does
think
it
that's
have to be the same thing? Are you saying that if someone has like a wound where they have been abandoned in some way, or someone has a wound where they were abused in some way, physically maybe, like whatever that may be, does it have to mirror itself, or is it that someone can empathize because they've been hurt this amount, or this, or
right.
or
No,
hurt by
it
maybe this
doesn't.
person?
Yeah, no, it doesn't have to be the same.
Okay.
No, not at all. And it doesn't need to be the same story in the sense of like, oh, that's the reason why I can't see you because that's too close to mine, right? I
Okay.
think to me, it's much more about, right, that level, like the connection to vulnerability, that fear of like what this is going to open up. And so I can stay surface level with you, right? Where I'm like, again, like I said, like, thank you for sharing. And I, appreciate you and can see
So
that.
it's like when someone shares something that's like makes them cry, or like something that hurts them, like makes them feel very insecure, then you go, okay, here's something that makes me really emotional and something that makes me really feel insecure. And then they don't have to be the same at all, but they invoke the same emotion.
Right.
And they give you the same, it's almost like it's like an access point to the amount of your heart that you're willing to show them and your
Totally.
truth. And you go, look, I'm going to bring in 2 big bags full. Here you go. And you bring me your bags full. And then you kind of go, okay. And that is what creates the I feel seen, is that you're willing to be that level of vulnerable with someone. Because as another thing that I like to say is, trust is a big thing in a relationship. And it's like, yeah, I want to trust you, but if you don't give me anything to trust, how do you know I'm trustworthy?
Right.
Like you have to give someone something to be trusted with. And so you do that for each other. You kind of go, okay, I'm going to meet you there. And that is the I feel seen, I feel heard.
Another reason that I've seen is when now an adult who was once a child who was an emotional support or caretaker for a parent, for example, where they were in a role that they should not have been in, and that parent overshared. They let that child in on very intimate details of their life, their feelings, right? Like the child was really just like kind of along for the ride and saw a lot of it. That is another example where I can see sometimes a person be really closed off or shut down to feeling alongside of a partner, for example, because of the very painful experience and exhaustive experience of being in a role of caretaking that emotional experience of a parent. And so again, right, sort of an unresolved stuff, right? But the unresolved stuff that blocks a person from being able to actually open themselves up, connect, see, hear, understand, be a partner to someone in the way, if we're prioritizing intimacy and vulnerability, right? And so, a lot of this, well, I guess I would say all of this would come from something that's unresolved, right? Like why would I not be able to or want to see you, hear you, understand you, connect to you, be intimate, vulnerable with you? Well, because there's something that's unresolved for me, whether it's, an example like I just gave of a child who had to be, the emotional caregiver of a parent to someone who has a part of their story and their own pain that they have yet to touch and be able to resolve themselves. right? And so, yeah, you think it's like, again, what is that constraint to being able to connect with you? And I think it's why, for therapists, especially, no surprise that most therapists get into this work to resolve their own stuff, right?
Oh my God,
but it's like,
girl, you're preaching to the choir. I try and tell people when they get mad if a guru or a therapist or someone that's supposed to be an expert in a field is having a struggle. It's like, why the hell do you think that they got into this field? It's like, you usually become an expert in something because you need it.
Therapists balance the science and the art form. And I think there's, the more truly, right, like the more integrated, the more resolved we are, right? Like we can hold that space in a very different way. And, you have therapists in any profession, right, who are like very skilled, moderately skilled, et cetera, right? And it's like, but all of this, right, to see clients, right, to be able to feel, to deeply connect, to have that other person on the other side or in the room or whatever the scenario is now, post-COVID, right, is like that, so much of that, right, what the other person feels of like, no, she really, like, I feel deeply seen by this person, right, has a lot to do with our own resolution, right? And then, listen, it's a skill set, certainly, right? There's an art form to this practice, right? There really is, but there is a need, right? Like there's so many people who are not doing that resolution work, and there's going to be a disconnect there, right? And so, I think you're talking probably more about, intimate partnership or relationship of like, okay, how can somebody really see and feel and connect? It's the same thing though with whomever. Right? It's like the more resolved a person is, the more able they are to deeply see, feel, connect, and understand.
The more connected you are to yourself, the more you can connect with others.
Yeah.
It's a mirror. Relationships are a big mirror.
Yeah. And it's a cliche for a reason. Like it's real, it's like, it's absolutely true.
What are some signs for people that are sort of walking through their life that they can look for, that are hopefully as simple as possible, because these things are just so hard to see. Like it's almost like it takes like a rock bottom or a really big event to get you into it. So like, let's save people from that. Like, what is it that they should look for to get them to go, okay, I'm going to take a next step here to excavate myself. Like what could be happening in their life that would be good signs that they should do a little bit of work? Because look, there are some unicorns out there, I'm sure, that end up in this whole securely attached relationship category. I've never met one. I don't know of one, but usually we fall into one of these origin wounds. Yeah. We fall into an anxious attachment or an avoidant, and it creates a lot of problems. So what are some big signs that you could do some work?
Okay. Number one, think about the last time you were really reactive. Reactivity is a direct line into it. It points the arrow. And, when we're reactive for good reasons, boundaries being crossed, we're hurt by something. Here's the pattern again, right? Like reactivity is beautiful, important information. So if you can think back to the last time you were reactive or the things that make you the most reactive, spend time there, because they're going to point an arrow to something that's unresolved.
Oh yeah. What's a good prompt for that? You're great with prompts. Ooh. There's a lot of prompts in the book. So what's a good prompt that people could go like right now, sit down and write blah, 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 blah.
Yeah. Like the thing that makes me most reactive is person I am most reactive with is I react when they, right? So just a few there just to get going, right? Of just like, who gets under my skin, right? Yeah. What's the thing, right? Is it something they do? Is it a look that they give? Is it the words that they speak? Is it the words that they don't speak, right? Like what's the thing that just gets me going and revs my engine, right? Because it's there that's going to be like, yeah, it's that damn look that you give that makes me feel looked over, unimportant, like you could give two shits about me. Or, and it's like, or it's the thing that you do where I'm just like, I've asked you so many times and you will not prioritize what I've asked you to do. Oh, okay, boom, there it is. Let's explore that further, right? So yeah, reactivity, so important, big line. In the same vein, if there is a time where you are reflecting and you're like, wow, I blew that thing out of proportion. Again, in the same vein as reactivity, but that's a pretty good indicator too, where you're like, whoa, that didn't seem to match what just played out. I have to look at that a little bit closer.
Overreaction is a good indicator.
Yeah, it is. And listen, sometimes it's hard to, be reflective on that where you're like, oh yeah, that was like bigger than it maybe needed to be. But, again, it's in response to something, right? That's what's so beautiful about our systems. Like they're responding to something appropriately. It might not be this particular moment, right? But it's responding to something that the system is experiencing appropriately. So we don't have to shame ourselves. We don't have to get upset with ourselves. We just have to get curious and bring that inquiry forward to see like, ooh, okay, I need to like dig around here and see what needs my attention. I love the like, when you can give the advice to everyone else, but you can't take it yourself.
Why are you
I'm not calling you out.
I mean, the only other thing I ever wanted to be in my life before I was a race car driver or while I was a race car driver is I thought I would like to be a therapist.
Well, second career. Okay. It's coming.
Oh no, I just do it on the side.
You're like, no, this is for fun.
The real problem is when it's in a relationship and I go, can I psychoanalyze you right now? And they go, fuck no, you can't.
Stay out. And you're like, listen, it's happening.
I'm like, but I want to.
Yeah. So for so many of us, right, the like, I'm able to give this advice to everyone else. And, but when it comes to me doing it, there's a big struggle there. So for example, your friend has an interview for a job. And you're like, go in there confidently, and you start like kind of preaching and giving that advice. But when it comes to you having the job interview, you are not confident, you're struggling with things, your self-critic is super active, all of this stuff. And it's like, bam, there it is, right? Like there's something that needs to be resolved there. And there's a wound there for you, right? If the thing that you're telling everybody else to do is not something that you can do fairly easily, right? Then there's an inquiry there. I know the wrinkle of the nose is like, ooh, what's to look at? Unwanted patterns, right? It's like we all have them where you're like, we get into the same fight with the person over and over and over again, or you lose track of what you're even fighting about, but it's the same thing going on and on and on, or you get hooked. I use that language, but it kind of feels that way where you're like, I promise I go in with good intentions. And then bam, like I'm back like engaging in a conversation that I know I don't want to have with this person, but I couldn't help myself. And I just needed to prove my point or get my point across or something like that. Obviously patterns are endless. There's so many examples. I keep choosing emotionally unavailable people who I continue to date.
About me again,
et cetera, et cetera. You're like, no. And so, again, but those are the things, right? Those are the arrows that are like, okay, our behavior is pointing us to something, right? These patterns that we're like, I don't want to keep doing this, never again, right? People proclaim, I will never do this thing again, right? And like, we mean it when we say it, but then we find ourselves back in the familiar. And okay, things will remain familiar like that until there is more resolution, grieving, witnessing, eventually making that pivot. And so, yeah, those unwanted patterns in our adult life are another great example of, just like a quick bam, like, okay, what's the unwanted pattern that I have in my life? There it is. Okay, I need to examine that more. So those are some good examples of just like quick signs, like the neon sign, it's just flashing there. Look for the reactivity, look for the patterns, look for the advice you give, but you can't take, look for the things that don't match and are blown out of proportion, right? Like look for those things and just, get curious about what wound it could be pointing to.
Recently talking to men about this sort of masculine feminine balance. And I think it'd be great to ask you, I've been asking a lot of guys, like I asked your husband, Connor, about, a healthy masculine, a healthy feminine energy. Like what does a healthy feminine and masculine energy within a woman look like?
The feminine and the way it's often described is like the flow. It's the life force, it's the playfulness. We always laugh when it's like, the feminine is life and the masculine is death. But it's like, no, it's I'm going to use this language because I think it ties this all together, is that when we resolve a lot of our pain and our wounds, or we're in that practice of it, right? Not the sense of completion, but when we are resolving those things, we're touching them, we're in conversation with them. I really believe it's when those like the light traits get to come forward. So, the list,
like the vigilant masculine energy to protect you,
right,
starts to dissolve.
Exactly. Right. And that's what I was going to say. Like, we've got lists of like the shadow masculine and the shadow feminine and the light masculine and the light feminine. And it's like, I just want to tie this all together because, like the hypervigilance, the aggression, this, it's the more that we resolve, the more anyone, right, steps into the light. Right. So it's like the more I can step into my playfulness, for example, the more I can step into my flow, the more I can step into my ease, the more I can put down the like, go, 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 and production and, like winning and this. And it's so funny, right? Because you win anyway, you produce anyway, like it all happens, but the drive is not coming from the pain. Right. The drive is coming from the resolution. Oh my gosh. Like I feel that saying that, where I'm like, that's it. Right. Is like life comes from the resolution. It doesn't come from the pain, right? Living doesn't come from the pain. I often say that our pain, our wounds and our gifts are really close to one another. Like so many of our gifts birth from our pain. There's a point in life where we don't need to be motivated by the pain with the gifts anymore. Like a lot of times people are so afraid to resolve the pain because they feel like they're going to lose the gift. Sure. And, it's
the
like,
edge, whatever it is.
Exactly. Right. The edge. That's it.
We've talked about that.
Yeah. You will not lose the edge just because you resolve things, right? Your gift gets to remain. It just gets to be driven by your healing instead. And so, back to your question, like men, women, masculine, feminine energies that we all hold, right? Is like the goal is to resolve as much as possible so that you get to be in the light with all of those traits, characteristics, qualities that exist on those lists, right? And to be driven by the healing. It is I promise you, it is a better existence. And I promise you that you will not lose the incredible things that you have gained from your story. So many people say, well, I wouldn't be who I am without the pain, without the story. I'm like, you're right. Absolutely. Right. I wouldn't be me. You wouldn't be you. And every single listener wouldn't be who they are today without the story. I'm like, well, I wouldn't go back and change the story. It's like, we get caught in this space of like, so I'm just going to like, thank you for the pain. It's like, listen, it's played out. We're here. Yeah, that was my story. You've got your story. And now it's time to resolve. And I can be I can acknowledge and be grateful for the gifts that I am now using in this world that are motivated and coming from a healing place, right? But I don't need to be grateful for the pain, the abuse, the this, the that, the things that I witness. I don't have to be grateful for that. I can acknowledge that that's my story. I can see what birthed from it. Right? I can hold on to these gifts that I have that came from that specific story that needed to happen the way that it did in order for me to unfold into this human I am today. But I don't need to sit here and protect a story or diminish it or minimize it or validate it in some weird way or, protect it or rationalize it or intellectualize it, right? Like the main part, like a big part of what I try to say in the book is like, we have to call our story the story. We have to name the things. And if we tamper with it at all, we tamper with our healing, right? If we have to say, oh, but it all happened for like good reason, it's like, no, that takes away from us being able to connect to the actual pain and the actual wounds. So I know I moved away from your question, but I got on a little roll here.
That's good. That's the flow. I mean,
it's the flow.
It feels so much like maybe, and I'm not going to go into detail of all the reasons why I think this, but it's like the masculine is kind of like the thing you want or like the aspiration or the goal. And then the feminine goes, let's go, and just like flows with it and allows whatever to come through because we think we always know the best way for things to happen. But when the universe goes ahead and lines it up for us, it happens in ways that we could never orchestrate ourselves. And then you go, oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty great. Like, what if I just, I need to be in that space more often. What do you think is the, again, on this sort of topic of masculinity and femininity, I feel like there's so many men that are confused, and I feel like there's, and rightfully so, I think at this point in time, but also, there's like a resistance to the word patriarchy and, but maybe just highlighting what could come more into balance for men and for women.
Men grew up, the men we know, in some ways, maybe it's shifting a little bit now, but, men grew up very conditioned to not feel, it's no surprise, right? Not feel, not be connected to emotion, not be vulnerable. The emotion that they were able to express or connect to is anger, which often comes out as, aggression. And, there's a lot of, I think one of the things I hear from men a lot is like, I guess if they're dating women want us to be vulnerable, but then when we're vulnerable, they see that as either a weakness or they see that as a turnoff or like they don't know how to be with it. And, I think there's just there's a lot of war on men, war on like that's going on. There's a lot of hatred, and towards anybody. It's not just directed.
There's a lot of identity politics going on. There's a lot of victimization going on. There are a lot of problems, but there is a lot of drama around it too.
Yeah, and I remember seeing a post where a person, a therapist, had posted some statistics about men and suicide, and there were endless comments in that Instagram post of presumably women saying like the job's not done until they all kill themselves, or God. It was beyond, and that hurts me to see. There's so much anger and, the collective irresolution. I've used the word unresolved probably like 100 times today, but to think about like the irresolution that is the collective irresolution that makes us hate each other, that makes us not find a way to come together and hold, again, that context, right? Which does hold accountability with grace and compassion. I would say to your question, I wish that more people could hold that balance. to your question, what do I think we need to be doing? It's like, we need to be able to hold accountability with grace and compassion for ourselves and with others. It's not an excuse. Obviously, there are plenty of people in history, in the world today, who abuse their power, who, behave in atrocious ways. Absolutely. But we use broad strokes instead of calling out specific people. We use the irresolution, right, on the collective scale, and we stay in just this angry and hateful place. And that's a disconnector, always will be, right? There's no bridge there.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, that's my wish, is that we can be reminded. It's funny, I'll tie it, like, there's a part right at the end of the book, I talk about something that Michael Kerr says, which is, think of your mother as your grandmother's daughter and see the perspective that shifts.
Oh yeah, it feels similar to, like,
Yeah,
see my inner child and know that my mom was a daughter, and my, like, just everybody was just a innocent kid at some point.
I'm a newish mother. I have a 21-month-old, and when you are close to a little human like that, as a little boy, like, that's the reminder, right? Is like, that person you hate, or that collective group of humans that you hate, it's like, we have lost the story.
Yeah.
We've lost the story. We've lost the reminder that we're all wounded, and again, not an excuse, right? Plenty of people who have abused power or like, exist in the world in a really awful, awful way. Absolutely. Right. But to be able to balance that feels so important to me. And, when you're around babies and you're like, we all started there, every single one of us. And there is a big, grand, deep story, right? And like, we could all just get to know these stories a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And, at the very minimum, right, if we can start to get to know our story a little bit more, if I can start to get to know my partner's story a little bit more, my friend's story a little bit more, my parents' story a little bit more, my siblings' story a little bit more.
Gosh, how many relational situations are we in where we don't actually know how our mom was treated growing up? We don't actually know what happened with our dad's dad. Like, we don't actually, we don't hear any stories, it's crazy. Okay. Well, it's such a good point. Maybe we could finish off here with just, kind of giving people some insight. If people said yes to growth, like, if people are like, hey, like, I'm ready, like, where are all those ways that you can, like, what are the best ways to grow? And also, what are the best access points? Meaning, like, a child, a relationship, a dog, a mom, like, where are those, like, hot buttons? Cause I feel like I just, you know me, I'm always talking about relationships, cause everything else I just, like, I'm cool with. But, like, people get into relationships and they get mad if they get, if they get upset. It's like, dude, it's meant to bring out all the shit. Like, relationships are like, you want to grow, stay in, so, like, where are the places where people can go, I'm willing to stand in the fire? And then what are the tools when you're in the fire to go, okay, I'm going to get through? And that, what is that path?
Well, certainly, like, intimate relationships are the greatest. I love that you started with kids. Like, have a baby.
Yeah,
like,
right.
Maybe,
I'm sure.
Yeah, like, maybe don't jump in right there, but LOL, it happens sometimes, of course. But it is, wow, the mirror it's big. But any intimate relationship is going to do that for you, certainly. Initiatory experiences, right? So, like, pushing your edge a bit. You know, I think there's something that happens when it's like you like cross that line of oh, this is really cozy and comfy for me. But when you kind of pass that threshold, right, I think we meet parts of ourselves. And I'm sure you had experiences like this when you were driving to getting to the place where there's the darkness. Where you come into contact with the darkness, you know, like you're going to grow quite a bit in that space.
Fear.
I was listening to, you know who David Goggins is?
Oh yeah.
It's like people think it's masochistic, but it's not. For me, it's like I don't grow in the light, right? I only grow from the dark. And so I exist there. I want to stay there because that's the way that I grow and evolve. My suggestion is not to go to Goggins style, but you know, there is something to, you know, whether you do that work with a therapist, whether you do that in a retreat group setting. I've loved, you know, there's some of my most favorite experiences of life, right? Is running retreats and having, you know, 12 strangers come and do deep, deep, deep work and seeing the impact of strangers witnessing one another. And like I said before, it's like, I don't need the person who put the wound there in the first place to be the person who witnesses it, right? Sometimes it's a stranger. Sometimes it's someone you've known for 24 hours who's there. And so, you know, finding clinicians or finding practitioners who you respect, who you trust, right? Like getting to know their work a little bit and maybe going to work with those people. Obviously, as a therapist, I'm always mindful of like, do I support this? Do I not? But I think that obviously there's a lot of, you know, psychedelic treatment, that is coming into therapeutic practice, legal some places, not legal other places. Very mindful again of that. But I know plenty of people who have had such incredible experiences in a therapeutic environment, you know, where it's deeply, 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 deeply healing. And of course, right, like again, you're meeting yourself in a very different way in an experience like that. When you're in it, it's not linear. You've probably heard it before, but just the reminder, right, that this is a dance. You do sometimes take a couple steps forward and then many, many, many steps back. And sometimes you move, or the lesson has to come back again in different form, in different shape, and different size. But having good people in your life to support you in that space so that you're not walking the path by yourself. Like sometimes we do have to take the walk on our own with certain things, right? Where it's like, I don't need people to hold my hands in this space, but to make sure that your support is there. I think a lot of times people, you know, unfortunately, right, there are many people in this world who don't feel like they have people in their lives they can turn to and share the most intimate details with. And, you know, I think that's one of the most important things when you're walking this path is to become a part of something, whether that means joining a men's group or women's group or whatever, like even if it's a virtual group, like, but that there is a community for you to feel supported, a community where people can reflect things back to you or continue to process with you, you know, to open up with at least one person to let them know, you know, what it is that you are navigating through. If you don't have a partner, or if you don't have, you know, a family member you would share that with. And so
saying the words out loud is so powerful. I mean, you see it all day, every day in your work, but when somebody has to say the words out loud, it's just like it unlocks the emotion and helps it flow through you.
Yeah. And just that, like, no matter how hard it is, like, even though you can't see it in the moment sometimes, right? That like the dots don't make sense or they're not all connecting. It's like to trust, you know, again, I know it's like one of those things that people are like, oh my God, I've heard it so many times, but there is something to trusting the process truly, right? That like this process is going to lead you somewhere. Keep going, pause if you need to, take breaks when you need to, certainly, right? Like I've had plenty of people who are like, take a break from therapy and then, you know, a year later poke back up, you know, it's like, yeah, that's it, right? Like pause when you need to, take a break, go out into the world, do the thing, see what it's like, right? And then sort of re-enter back into the space when you need more support. So yeah, just again, grace, compassion with the self as you move through it, gentleness, and awareness that, yeah, like it can shift the way that you see the world and see people and the way that you've held them. And so sometimes it can feel a bit destabilizing. But with proper support and good alignment with the people you choose to be a part of that support system, there's some beautiful stuff in there.
Yeah.
There really is.
Yep.
There really is.
Well, thank you for sharing that beautiful stuff and helping people step into a reality that's more peaceful and more joyful. It does not mean they're excluded from pain. It does not mean that's not part of life. But I always think that the reason for the work is because I want to be happier more of the time. And I also want to reach higher levels of joy.
Yeah.
Like I want to be able to, my heart breaks open to the pain, it breaks open equal and opposite to the joy.
Mm-hmm.
And like the more we can give ourselves permission to just go into deeper spaces, the more we open our heart up. It's kind of like that vulnerability game of like, oh, how far are you going to go? Okay, I'll meet you there.
Yeah.
So thank
you.
Such
a good point. It's such a good point. I think Brene Brown, said it maybe in a TED talk. Like you can't pick and choose which feelings you turn down and up, right? Right. So it's like when you turn the dial down, you turn it down on all of them. When you turn it up, you turn it up on all of them. And I think you just, you said it there. It's like, yeah, you're going to feel the sadness, but then you're also going to feel the joy. And yeah, like it's a decision. Again, sometimes we need our hand to be held, but a decision to turn up the feelings and to step into that. So
hold the hand. I know. Congratulations. I'm so proud of you. I know how hard you worked. I remember the moments when you're like, okay, I'm deep in book stuff. We need to we need to take a break from therapy now. And you were working so hard. So I'm just so proud of you. I've never written a book, but I have had a couple books, and I just know, like, even from my side, it's a lot of work. So, congratulations. And I can't wait to, just witness the world as we move forward and having people like you share this information and people healing.
Thank you. I appreciate you.
Yeah. Miss you, dear.
Yes. Right back.
Thanks everybody for listening to the Pretty Intense podcast today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you heard today and you want to hear more, please click on the subscribe button.